Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm In-jung Cho. The top nuclear envoys from the U.S., South Korea, and Japan met in Indonesia and reaffirmed the goal of denuclearizing North Korea. And a senior American diplomat traveled to Seoul and sought ways to further strengthen the U.S.-South Korea alliance that marks its 70th anniversary next year. Today, we discuss the U.S.-RK alliance and ways to best deal with provocative North Korea.
That the DPRK presents one of the most serious security challenges in the region and beyond.
Let me highlight that the international community will never recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapon state.
We will examine all options, including counter-strike capability.
In the studio with me, Mr. Heino Klinck, Senior Advisor at the National Bureau of Asia Research and Principal at Klinck Global, a Washington-based consulting firm. Mr. Klinck was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia during the Trump administration. Mr. Klinck is a retired U.S. colonel with multiple assignments in Asia. Also joining us, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's new edited volume reviews the first decade of North Korean foreign policy under Kim Jong-un. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Snyder, top nuclear envoys of the U.S., South Korea, and Japan met in Indonesia, and they emphasized a firm and unified response against North Korea's provocations. Did the U.S. run out of all policy options that now they're only emphasizing coordinated alliance actions?
Well, I think that it's true that the UN Security Council pathway is blocked as a result of Sino-U.S. rivalry and the war in Ukraine, deterioration U.S.-Russia relations. But I think there's a lot to say for trilateral coordination, in particular after the trilateral statement that was issued in Phnom Penh last month, because that statement actually details a lot of new areas where the three countries are trying to work together. And so there's a lot of opportunity, actually, to build trilateralism in practice. And there's also a great need to enhance enforcement as related to all deterrence activities related to North Korea.
Where's the use of trilateral coordination if you cannot put any impact or influence North Korea?
It provides a united front against North Korean provocations, and I think that maybe the best metric for analyzing the significance of that is do the North Koreans notice? And I think the North Koreans do notice when the U.S., Japan, and South Korea are on the same page.
Now, Mr. Klinck, they also emphasized the need to use all available tools to further restrain North Korea's nuclear and missile developments. Do you think there's any new tool that needs to be used and should be used?
Well, I believe that the historic use of sanctions can certainly be tightened even further. And I think after the last rounds of testing, you've seen Japan and South Korea and the United States look at additional sanctions options. And I believe that not just new sanctions, but more robust sanctions enforcement is, of course, paramount. And there are certain areas, of course, where sanctions need to be tightened with respect to cryptocurrency and other cyber crimes and cyber thefts that the North Korean regime is conducting, which frankly is one of the big ways that they are able to fund the modernization of their missile inventory and nuclear capabilities as well. So I do think there's some additional things that can be done.
Mm-hmm. The Biden administration has not lifted any sanctions on North Korea ever since the Trump administration. Yet I hear former Trump administration officials like Vice President Pence saying that the pressure has eased. What is your take?
I think that pressure certainly remains. I believe that for the most part, the Biden administration is carrying through with some of the same policies that the Trump administration inaugurated and kept the pressure on. I think the challenge, of course, is how can we actually deter and dissuade the North Koreans from this path that they have chosen? As my colleague mentioned, the UN as a venue for exerting additional pressure is difficult given the PRC and the Russian Federation's not helpful role as part of the PERM 5. I'm not confident that in the short run we're going to get past that. Nonetheless, I think we need to redouble our efforts, and I think, again, the fact that Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington are working in concert with one another is perhaps the strongest message to the regime in Pyongyang that there will be a cost imposition with regards to moving forward on this path of destabilization.
Now, Mr. Klinck, talking about North Korea's missile capabilities, North Korea just announced that it has successfully tested solid fuel rocket motor for ICBM with 140-ton force. Would this increase its threat against the mainland United States?
In short, yes. We have seen an unprecedented number of missile tests this last year, I think 63, 8 of which have been considered to be ICBM-like or ICBM-capable. Any advances that the North Koreans make in engines and being able to propel a warhead is certainly of concern to the United States, and it's something that I'm confident that the Biden administration is watching very carefully.
Now, Mr. Snyder, at the trilateral of the top nuclear envoys, another key message was on the denuclearization goal. Special Representative of South Korea said that international community is pursuing denuclearization of North Korea and that they will not reconsider that goal in a million years. The State Department also says that the goal of denuclearization will not change. Now, back in October, we were here talking about Undersecretary Bonnie Jenkins talking about the arms control is an option with North Korea. Ever since, State Department said the goal did not change and it is still a denuclearization. Is the State Department trying to water down Bonnie Jenkins' comments? And is she reflecting some of the changing thinkings in Washington?
The official policy documents of the United States, all of them, are stating very clearly an intolerance for a nuclear North Korea. Nuclear posture review, our defense strategy, across the board, any official document contains that. Bonnie Jenkins did mention arms control, but honestly, I don't think that there is necessarily a conflict between pursuing arms control and pursuing denuclearization. In fact, it may well be that the path to denuclearization goes through arms control. And so we have to grapple with the fact that some of the means that one might use in order to achieve a particular long-term objective doesn't necessarily mean that you're giving up on the long-term objective. So I actually think that this is a false debate that has emerged in our community, and that the way to resolve it is to reiterate denuclearization, but also indicate openness to actually talking about how do you address North Korea's activities in a way that would reduce risk.
The caveat there is that when you say arms control, some people take it as you start arms control first recognizing the counterpart as an arms state, nuclear arms state.
Well, that's the reason why the declaratory policy is so important, and the nuclear posture review restrictions, particularly the warnings related to use, are so important. Because it makes clear that we're not giving up on the long-term objective.
Now, Mr. Klinck, relatedly, many experts say the collapse of the Hanoi summit is an inflection point where Kim Jong-un changed his thinking and pursued more aggressively his nuclear and missile pursuit. Do you think had the Hanoi summit not collapsed and had the United States continued its conversation with North Korea, would we be at a different place now?
Well, I would argue that no deal is better than a bad deal. And the deal that the North Korean regime was pursuing at Hanoi would have been a bad deal for the United States, for its regional allies, and I would say for the world writ large. I am not an advocate for lifting, easing, suspending sanctions for some sort of partial North Korean concession, or even for the North Koreans to return to diplomatic talks. And my sense was that Kim was not willing to take the steps that the United States government had laid down as part of the offer. So you can argue whether or not the situation became more dire after Hanoi. I think we had a period where, at least in terms of ICBM testing, as well as, of course, there hasn't been a nuclear test since then either, that you could say that helped stabilize things a bit. But now in the last 2 years or so, especially in the last year in particular, the North Koreans have ramped up everything short of a nuclear test.
Mr. Snyder, how consequential was the collapse of the Hanoi summit when we look at where North Korea is now?
Well, I think that the collapse of the Hanoi summit put us on a different trajectory as related to this issue of denuclearization, primarily because both sides have their own set of lessons learned. And on the U.S. side, I think the lesson learned was that even the leader could not agree to complete denuclearization. And so the problem with that is that it actually diminishes the perceived value of re-engaging in nuclear talks, even though the current administration continues to offer talks. And on the North Korean side, I think that the main lesson that Kim Jong-un learned is that his perceived position of strength was not credible to the United States. And that's the reason why he's engaging in military development and in trying to develop capabilities that would actually make him be able to enter into negotiations from a stronger position in order to be able to achieve his objective. But the reality is that both of these lessons learned actually drive the U.S. and North Korea further apart, and they make it much harder to imagine that a profitable or useful negotiation can occur.
Now, Mr. Klinck, Asian Affairs Director General in Japan's Foreign Ministry, Mr. Funakoshi, said that the trilateral security cooperation between U.S., South Korea, and Japan is at the highest level, and that it will strengthen even further if North Korea pursues its seventh nuclear test. President Biden also said the U.S. will increase its military presence in Asia should North Korea continue with its provocations. How do you think in the coming year or two, how fast and intensified will the trilateral security cooperation be?
Well, we've seen just in the last several months at least two separate occasions where the three countries' navies operated together in ballistic missile defense exercises. One, I think, just recently in the October-November timeframe. And that's the first time I think that we've done that in a number of years. So I think that's already an indicator of both countries' desire to strengthen those trilateral ties. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the United States military is a very dynamic organization, and we have the capability to project power on very short notice. If North Koreans take provocative actions that threaten American interests, as well as our allies in the region, as well as our own people in the region, we have to remember not just American military forces, almost 30,000 in Korea, over 50,000 in Japan, but the hundreds of thousands of American citizens that live there. I'm confident that the Biden administration will deploy the assets required to protect those interests and those people.
Now, Mr. Klinck, Japan unveiled a new security strategy marking the biggest military buildup since World War II. Japan will now also exercise the counter-strike capability that can hit targets more than 600 miles away. Now, is now Japan projecting military power, and is the U.S. fully supporting Japan's new direction?
I think the unveiling of the Japanese national security strategy today, as well as some other Ministry of Defense documents, is a pivotal time in Japan's post-war history. And I think it's a reflection of the times it finds itself in with respect to the growing North Korean threat, not to mention the threat of the Chinese and the Russians as well. It was just, I think, 2 weeks ago where a joint Chinese-Russian air patrol entered the water station. Both Japan and South Korea, and both countries had to scramble fighters to intercept those aircraft. I think the Japanese are making what is a reasonable investment in its own defense, increasing the defense budget to the NATO standard of 2% of GDP over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think a counter-strike capability to be utilized if attacked by an adversary is something that is not only reasonable but responsible for a country to have. So I applaud this move.
So, Mr. Klinck, if North Korea launches missile, just recently missile flew over Japan, right? If North Korea launches missile and Japan decides to launch its counterattack capability, would it need some agreement from South Korea?
I do not believe that, given your scenario, that would require any type of South Korean government approval. I don't think it would require any third country's approval, to be quite frank. Again, I think the example of North Korean missiles being launched over Japan would not necessarily mean that the Japanese would use a future counterstrike capability. I'm confident that the Japanese will develop rules of engagement that will be robust enough to ensure that they only use that capability when it is called upon. But I would say, using your example though, that is another opportunity for trilateral cooperation and being able to increase info sharing, intel sharing, early warning sharing between South Korea, the United States, and Japan.
Mr. Snyder, if Japan launches counterattack capability against North Korean missile that is flying towards Japan, that Japanese counterattack could go near South Korean airspace. Do you think Japan needs some agreement from South Korea?
Well, I think actually what you're doing is making the argument for trilateralism because it's absolutely true that in a world where there's not coordination between the U.S. and Japan and the U.S. and South Korea, there's a whole host of adventures that North Korea could take us on that could lead one country to believe that the U.S. had responded too weakly, and the other country might view the U.S. response as too strong. And so that's actually the reason why the trilateral coordination piece is so important, in addition to the issue of mistrust and intentions between Japan and South Korea that might exist.
So most recently, the three countries decided to share missile warning data, and before that, South Korea and Japan had GSOMIA. Which would come more handy in this kind of scenario?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. As a matter of fact, I think GSOMIA is the foundation for being able to share that type of information. So I think they reinforce each other.
Now, Mr. Snyder, the top nuclear envoys again called for China's constructive role in restraining North Korea. We've been hearing this for months, that China needs to play a constructive role. But what specifically can China do and should do?
Sanctions enforcement and condemnation of North Korean violations of UN Security Council resolutions. Those are the two essential things that China should be doing.
So it is deliberately not doing those things?
Well, it's not happening, and I believe that the Chinese state is more capable capable enough to be able to achieve those objectives.
Now, I want to look at the more modernized and expanded U.S.-RK alliance. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Daniel Kritenbrink, met with his South Korean counterpart and vowed to take the alliance to the next level as it marks its 70th anniversary next year. Now, Mr. Kritenbrink said the alliance is truly stronger than ever. Mr. Snyder, a few years ago, we were here talking about the pacing and coordination of the policy. What has changed ever since?
Well, one thing is that the bilateral statements between actually Biden and Moon and Biden and Yoon are both incredibly more robust and really envision a comprehensive range of security and non-security cooperation. And so actually you can go all the way back to the US-ROK joint statements of 2009 and 2013 and compare them with the recent statements, and it provides you with a good timeline for just the incredible growth in the intensity of institutionalized cooperation between the US and South Korea. And I would also add that I'm quite surprised actually, the bilateral alliance I think is more applicable to the global environment than I would have expected, and you can even see that in the response to Ukraine.
Now, Mr. Klinck, South Korea's Yoon Suk-yeol government vows to take a more global role. What can South Korea do more militarily in line with U.S. efforts in Indo-Pacific to keep the rules-based order there?
So I would say the Yoon administration has already done quite a bit in terms of its own Indo-Pacific strategy and the very, very close alignment of strategic documents and statements made by our national leaders. And I think it does, in fact, go beyond just the peninsula. South Korea is a global power. It has almost unmatched soft power, and its hard power has been increasing, particularly in the economic arena. Now it's the number 10 economy in the world and so on. I believe that the fact that President Yoon has been a very strong advocate for also a free and open Indo-Pacific, mirroring the language that we use in the United States and the Japanese use as well, is meant to be a sign to forces in the region that are not necessarily in favor of the rules-based order. So obviously we're talking about the DPRK, the Russian Federation, but also, quite frankly, the People's Republic of China. Mm-hmm. And I think, again, the more that South Korea can do to speak out against the malign activities of the PRC, its economic coercion, but also, frankly, its military aggression against Taiwan in particular. I think there's a very strong realization in South Korea that the future of Taiwan, specifically if the PRC chose to try to change the status quo unilaterally, will have a detrimental effect on the ROK. And I believe, quite frankly, it's only prudent for the U.S. and South Korean governments to talk about what would happen in the Taiwan contingency, because I think the United States has to ensure that it has the strategic flexibility to utilize all the forces at its disposal in the region in case that's required.
Do you agree with the critics that South Korea was not as vocal as Japan when it comes to Chinese aggression in the area?
I do agree with that. I think during the Moon administration, that there were some challenges. Quite frankly, if we compare the 2+2 statements that came out early in the Biden administration, there was a very large gap between what the U.S.-Japanese 2+2 statement had in it and what the U.S. ROK statement. Now, frankly, when President Moon visited the White House, I was very heartened to see that there was mention of peace and stability in Taiwan Strait. I think that was the start, quite frankly. But the juxtaposition of those 2+2 statements early in the Biden administration, that did not reflect well on South Korea, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Snyder, another area that we see an increased cooperation between the U.S. and South Korea is on the North Korean human rights. South Korea's envoy for Ministry's Korean Peninsula Peace Region Bureau visited Washington just recently and not only met with Deputy Assistant Secretary Jung Bak, but also Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Mr. Scott Busby. Now, do you think South Korea made the right decision to raise its voice on North Korea's human rights issues?
Yeah, I think it was clearly the right decision because we have a very clear track record over a long period of time of North Korean human rights violations. The Commission of Inquiry report from almost a decade ago was really an authoritative indictment of North Korea's human rights practices, and things have not improved. And so, in a way, the question is, why hasn't this issue remained as an active area for both South Korea and for U.S.-South Korea cooperation? Because even though those discussions have occurred, as you well know, the U.S. does not have a North Korean human rights envoy in place under the Biden administration, and it's been almost 2 years, and Ambassador Lee Shin-hwa from South Korea does not have a counterpart. Mm-hmm. And in order for this issue to be pushed effectively, especially in international fora, the U.S. and South Korea need to work together.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Mr. Snyder, Mr. Klinck, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.